Hi guys, it's Andrew Burgess with Ruby for Newbies Chapter 3, our Ruby screencast series here on NetTats. In this screencast series, we're going to look at the basic object class in Ruby and how we can use it to create custom objects. And then we're going to create those custom objects by creating classes for those objects themselves, so we don't have to create just basically a blank slate object and load it up with our methods and properties. We can create a class, define all those methods and properties beforehand. So let's get into that right now. All right, so let's open up our terminal here. Once this logs in, we're going to tell our VM that I want to use version 1.9.2 of Ruby, and let's open our interactive Ruby shell. Okay, so the basic object class is what all of the built-in classes in Ruby inherit from. So we can create a new object just by saying, we'll assign this to the variable O, and we just say object.new. And now you can see here, we've got our representation of a new object. Now, what comes built into a blank object? Well, if we say O.methods, you can see here we have an array with the names of all the methods that come built in to the object class. Most of these are not going to be that valuable to you. However, there are a few interesting ones, and we're going to look at those next week when we look at a lot of the built-in methods on a whole bunch of different Ruby classes that you're going to use just to get you up to speed on all of those. But let's say we want to create our own methods on this object, and we saw how to do that last week. We would say def o equals, and we'll just call this my method. Def, of course, meaning define the function, and then we have our function. Let's just say sum equals 1 plus 1, and then we can just say sum, and it would return sum equals 1 plus 1. I'm sorry, it will return sum, which equals 1 plus 1. And of course, we could just say 1 plus 1 because remember, Ruby returns the last expression from a function. So now we can just say o.myMethod, and I'm trying not to use the backspace key too much this time, and we get 2, of course. So that's pretty simple. Creating your own custom methods on an object like that is pretty simple. We can do properties very similarly, and this is something we have to talk about briefly because properties on an object in Ruby are relatively different from properties on objects in other languages. Often you just have, say, this is a public property on your class, and then when you instantiate an object, you can just say, object.property name to get it, and object.property name equals whatever to set it. However, in Ruby, you can't access properties quite like that. Instead, you access properties via methods. So let's say we want to have a property here. So we're going to say, and we'll call it, let's say we want to have a name on this object. So we're going to say set name. And remember, then I'll put parentheses with a name in it for our parameter. And, oh, I forgot the def keyword. So we're going to define this. And then we have to have a way to store that inside this object. Well, in Ruby, that's done with an instance variable. And usually an instance variable is where you're going to store your property, store the properties. In other languages, the instance variable is the property. However, an instance variable in Ruby isn't accessible by default outside of the Ruby objects. Outside the Ruby class or instance of the class that you're creating. You need to set up those methods to let them out. So then an instance variable starts with an @ sign, and we'll just call this @name, and then we'll just say equals name, and then we end that like that. Now let's create another one. We have def o, and we're going to say .getName, and then this one is just going to return &name. So you see that how that works now. If we say o.getName, you can see it's nil. If we change this to o.setName and pass in Andrew as the name, and then we say o.getName, you can see what's returned as Andrew. So that's how our variables work, getName and setName. Is are the functions that allow us to access that instance variable name, which as an instance variable, it begins with an ampersand. However, that looks a bit clunky, don't you think? Having the get underscore, then name, and set underscore name. Wouldn't it be nicer if we could just say name? Or, and do it as with other properties, if you've got maybe a property on a JavaScript object where we would just say o.name equals Andrew. Well, let's start building a class from scratch right now, and you'll see how we can do that with some really cool Ruby sugar. All right, I'm just going to exit out of the IRB console here. Let me just clear that. And now we're going to open Vim and start building a class of our own. Okay, we're going to build a person class. All right, and now we're going to edit a file. We're just going to call it person.rb. Okay, so here's our file. To create a class in Ruby, we just start with the word class, and then we put the name of the class. Then, when you're finished the class, you end with the end keyword. Okay, so inside our person class, we're going to have variables, and we're going to have methods, or properties and methods. However, the properties, of course, are stored in instance variables. Now, in most languages, we would declare all our instance variables at the top here. So we'd say at name, something like that. You know, if you were doing this in Java, that's generally the respected best practices. You put your instance variables at the top. However, in Ruby, we don't do it that way. You don't actually have to declare those instance variables anywhere apart from inside the functions that get and set them. Ruby will just take care of seeing where those are. So let's create those two functions that we just had in our object in the terminal. So we're going to say def. Now, we don't have to, in the terminal we did o.setName. In here, we don't have to do that because it knows any function that just has a regular name like that is an instance function and will be available when we create an instance of the object. So let's say setName. Name will be the parameter. And notice we don't need to put those quotes there. If that makes you feel better, we can just put those quotes there. Otherwise, that's not necessary. All right, so name, and then we're just going to say at name equals name, and it's that easy. There's a function to set our name. Then we can say def get name, and we're just going to return name, end. Okay, so let's run this in the console here. We're going to pop open IRB. And actually, no, I'm going to have to exit out of IRB and move to the desktop. And as you can see, we have the person IRB file there on the desktop. Now let's open IRB, and then we're just going to say require person. And what we're actually going to have to do is say /person. There we go. The dot just means the current directory. So in the current directory, find the person file. And true. So now that's been loaded into Ruby. Now we can use that class. So we're going to say p equals, and actually we'll do something more descriptive. We'll say Joe equals person dot new. Now, dot new, we never made a dot new method, but that is one of those things that Ruby inherits from object, which I believe may inherit from another class called basic object, which has even fewer methods than the object class that we looked at earlier. Anyway, so there's our new person. Now, let's call Joe.setName. And we'll pass it the name Joe, of course. And then we can say Joe.getName, and we'll return Joe, as you would expect. So there we go. Those are working perfectly. But remember, we said this syntax just looks ugly, having to say getName and setName. They really look like methods. They don't look like the properties that you're expecting. Let's fix that. Well, we can change getName easily. Just take off the get part. And now, name. So now, look at the end here. A hash is a Ruby comment. Now, we can just say something like Joe.name, and Ruby will return Joe. Something like that. What about for setName? It would seem that for setName, there's nothing you could do, but Ruby is such a cool language, and really, you're going to find this really neat. I remember when I first learned what I'm about to show you here, it blew me away, honestly. Name equals. That's the name of a function. Name equals name, and that's how we can do it. You might think that looks a bit awkward, but watch what we can do. So, I'm going to have to exit this and reload. There we go. All right, so we have Joe equals person.new. Joe dot. Now, you'd think we have to call this name equals and then pass in Joe, like that. Oops, and I forgot the closing parentheses. Or you said, okay, we know name's not equal, and we could say just Joe name equals Joe, like that. But still, if you want to put the spaces in there, Ruby lets you do that. Ruby understands exactly what we're saying here. So when we say Joe name equals Joe, it looks from the outside as if we're just setting the property name on the Joe object. We're just setting that equal to the word Joe, the string Joe. And that provides a elegant way to set the property. But under the covers, as we can see here, we actually have a function called name equals, and that does all the work. So right here, we could say name equals, and if we wanted to, we could put a last name here, right? Just like that. And that way, this method approach gives us the ability to do stuff with the input that we're given and not set name just equal to exactly what they've given us, but maybe we want to shuttle that to some other inner class that we're using, or, you know, we could do all kinds of different stuff with that value. We don't just have to have a name property that is now equaling the name value that they passed in. We can take the name value they passed in and do something intelligent based on our class. In this case, we're just assigning it, but, you know, we could add the last name like that. We're not going to do that. But theoretically, it's just as easy to do. And then, of course, here we can just say Joe.name, and as you can see, we'll return Joe. So it's really that easy. And then, of course, if we want to do age, we can just say def age equals age, just like that. And then up above def age, we can say def age equals age and just set at age equal to age, and it's that simple. So there we've just created another property. Okay, so that syntactic sugar is really nice, but there's a pretty good chance that most of the time you're creating instance variables like this, instance properties. This is exactly what you're going to want to do. You're going to set the property equals method to be exactly what they passed in, and then just the property method to be exactly what they passed in but previously, and pass it back out to them. If that's the case, then Ruby allows you to put it up at the top here. And what we're just going to do is use a special Ruby keyword, which is attribute accessor, to set up attributes or variables on your objects. So we can just say :name, :age, just like that, comma separated. This is a Ruby method, I believe. And we just pass in a symbol. You'll remember symbols from last week, lightweight strings, as how you can view them, : and then the name, : and name again, the name being age, of course. So what this does is this sets up an attribute accessor, as we just said, and basically it just writes exactly what we've written there. So these 14 lines of code, we can get rid of those because we can do it just like that. Now, you may notice that having this method way of accessing your instance variables makes it really easy to make a variable that you can set and not get, basically write but not read, or a variable that you can read and not write, at least from outside the class. So you'll, of course, be able to read and write them all from inside the class. And I should mention here with attr_accessor, if we want to, have def, what do we say, greet, something like that, then what we can do is send out @name says hello. And notice I need to go back here and escape that quote. But anyway, you get the idea. How, see, this variable that we're setting up here with the attr_accessor method, we can get via the @name, just like a normal parameter. And of course, we'll put an end here. Let's keep that for now. Now, we were just saying that having this name equals, the two different methods for getting and setting makes it really easy to make a variable that you can set and not get, or get and not set. And of course, you can still use those within your class. Ruby makes it really simple for you to set these as well, very simply by giving you the attr_reader method. So let's say read year of birth, because, and that doesn't really make sense in this case, but it just shows you, or the adder writer method. In this case, we could say wait, so you can read that, and that should be writer method. So you can read it, but you can't write to it. Or, I'm sorry, you can write to it, but not read to it. This one, the adder reader, you can read but not write. Adder accessor gives you access to both reading and writing. So that is the basics of properties on your methods. Okay, so now that we've looked at properties on our Ruby classes, let's fill in some of the methods on this class. We're going to delete these two because we don't need them. What other properties can we have in a person? Well, he's going to have a name, an age, a job. Let's do the weight. Not adder weight. We're going to set weight as something we can write to, but we don't want to be able to read it. Weight like that. All right, let's start with that for now. So we have a greet method here. What else can we do? Let's create a work method. And we're going to say, this is just going to return, I'm doing my job. I do at job for a living. And of course, depending on what they pass in as the job variable, that won't really make sense grammatically, but it gives you an idea on the kind of methods we can set. Of course, we can use that. So we set attribute writer here for the weight, and that takes care of the weight equals method. Let's set a writer here. I'm sorry, a reader on weight. So we're going to say weight, and what this is going to return is it's going to return weight minus 20 pounds, something like that. Just so that way, as you can see, our object can contain the true weight of this person, but when the person's asked for their weight, they are kind of a little more generous in their response. Okay. What else can we put on our person here? Well, let's add the ability to talk to another person. So we'll say def, and we're going to say talk to, and then we're going to pass in a person as our variable here. And we'll put quotes around it and actually that shouldn't be capitalized because that is the name of our class. That might get confusing. Okay, so now what we're going to do in here is I'm going to give you a taste of if statements, and we're going to look at blocks and conditionals and that kind of thing in a future lesson in Ruby. But very basically, we can just say if, and we're going to say person.class, and we saw the class method that every object inherits, and the class method just basically tells you what method it's a member of. If we go back over here to the terminal, you can see if we say joe.class, we get person as a response. And actually, if we say joe.class.class, you can see that person is of class, which shows you something really neat. And that is that even classes are a member or an instance of a class, and that is the class. And it gets a bit confusing in how all that structure behind Ruby works, but realize that Ruby is very, very class-based. Okay, so we're going to say if if person.class equals person, then, and notice we just have the if, our condition statement, and then we're going to have the end block at the end there. We don't have to put anything else, no quotes or anything. All right, so if the person variable that we were passed in is of class person, and actually, I'm sorry, we need to set that as a double equals there, of course, like any other language, because we're not setting it, we're comparing it. So if person is of class person, or if the person that we were passed is a passive person, then what are we going to output? We're going to output that at name is talking to, and then we're going to say person.name, because realize this person should have a name variable as well, and we can access that by saying person.name. Then we're actually going to put an else statement here, and we can say at name can't talk to them, or can't talk to it, it isn't a person. And so you can see there, and then we just have to add the end to our method. So this is how we'd use an if statement, and we'll look at this more in depth later, but you can see now we've got a variable that we're passing in, and we're actually taking a method, or, well, we are taking a method's value, but we're getting a attribute from this person object and comparing it with our own. All right, let's give this a trial run. So I'm going to save that, come back over here. We're going to have to exit that. Just clear that, then we'll get back into IRB here and require a person. All right, so we'll create a person named Joe. Person.new. There's Joe. And then we're going to create another person. We'll say Jill. Person.new. Now, if we say Joe.name, that's nil right now. And if we say Joe.talk to Jill, we get blank is talking to blank. So obviously it's working because Jill is a person, but neither of them have a name variable, a name attribute. So they're kind of useless. So we have to say Joe.name equals Joe, and we have to say Jill.name equals Jill. And then we can call Joe talk to Jill, and Joe is talking to Jill is our response. Let's also do this just to make sure. We'll say O equals object.new, and now we'll tell Joe to talk to O, and Joe can't talk to it because it isn't a person. And what we should actually just do is, instead of it, just pass in O there. Not O, sorry. Person. Because, oops, that'll just give us a better value there. Okay. So this brings up something interesting. Why can't we create a constructor function that will allow us to pass values into this person.new method to set up the variables that we want? And we definitely can do that. So let's do that right now. A constructor function is a function that runs at the creation of an object. That allows us to pass values in when we're creating the object and sets those, or we can do whatever we want with those. So in Ruby, the constructor function is called initialize. Initialize, if I can spell it right. And let's use quotes this time. Parentheses. Now I'm using them sometimes and not other times just to show you that it really doesn't matter. You can use them if you'd like to, and sometimes it does make it easier to kind of see how it's working, especially if you're used to working in something, another language that requires them, like PHP or JavaScript. If you're not, you don't have to, as long as you can understand exactly what's going on. You just don't want it to be confusing. So we're going to accept name, we're going to accept an age, and we're going to accept a job, we'll say. And we'll just end that right there. And then in here, we can say at name equals name, at age equals age, and at job equals job. It's that easy. Now, let's say they don't pass in a job. We can actually set a default job and make these properties optional by saying job equals right in here. So if they don't pass in a job, we are just going to say job is unemployed as the default job. We could set a default age, but that wouldn't make sense. So now let's go over here and create our new person. Again, I'm just going to have to exit this to reset what we're doing here. We're going to have our Joe again. So person.new, this time we can pass in Joe, we can pass in an age, we'll say 35, and we can pass in a job, just like that. And now we can say Joe.name is Joe, Joe.age is 35, and Joe.job is plumber. It's just that easy. All right, now let's create Jill. Just one more time to show you how this works again. Jill, and we can pass in Jill. We can say Jill is, we'll say Jill's only 13, and that's all. notice right here in this representation, we can see these instance variables right here. Name is Jill, age is 13, and job is unemployed. And if we say Jill.job, we do get unemployed. And of course, the other variables work as well. Jill.name and Jill.age. If we do Jill.talkToJoe, we can see everything else is still working. And if we ask Jill to talk to an object, you can see what we get is Jill can't talk to, and we get this object representation here because object is not a person. All right, there are a few more things to cover in creating a class in Ruby. The first one is class methods. A lot of classes have methods that you can call right off of them. And so this is a class method is a method that if we had, let's say we have a person method that, a class method on our person object that keeps track of how many people we've created. We could say .person, or here in the console, we could say person.count. And notice this isn't a person instance that we're calling the count method on. This is the person class itself that we're calling the count method on. So how do we create a class method that's not given to each instance of a class, but is put on the class itself? Also, that count, where is that count being kept? How can we create a class variable as opposed to an instance variable? Let's do that right now. So right here in initialize, let's create a class variable to keep track of how many people have been created. If an instance variable starts with a single @ sign, a class variable starts with 2 @ signs. So we're going to say @count, and what we can do is just say count equals, and actually we can just say count plus equals 1. So whatever count is plus 1. The plus equals operator is the same thing as saying count equals count plus 1. And you can use the plus equals operator in pretty much any language. So we have count equals count plus 1. Now, where do we get this count? Well, right after this initialize, we'll create our instance method, our class method. And the way we do this is by doing def self.count. Now remember, we talked about self last week. Self is Ruby's this variable. Other languages such as JavaScript or PHP use this or $this. In Ruby, it's self. So self in this case refers to the class itself, of course. So self.count is the way we create a class method. So self.count is just going to return @count. Very similar to the way we create an instance method, an instance variable. This is similar to the method, the getter or the reader method that we would use to create an instance method. Now, how do we set? We should set count equal to 0 to start with, right? And the way to do that would be just set up here. We can say @count equals 0. Remember, we don't have to set this at the beginning, but because we're starting out by adding 1 to it, we do want to make sure it's set to 0. So again, we initialize the variable up here, @count, which is our class variable, equals 0. And then in here, we set @count to just increment it by 1. All right, let's give this a try. Again, I'm just going to have to reset this. All right, so let's create a bunch of people here. We'll say person.new. We'll say Joe, 35, plumber again. We can say Jill, person.new equals Jill. And we can say she's 13. Then let's have Bob equals person.new Bob. Age, let's say he's 70. All right, so we've created 3 people there. Let's now call person, which is our class, .count. And as you can see, we get a response to person 3. Now, if we call Bob.count, you can see that count, we get the no method error, undefined method count for person object. So that count method, because we said self dot in front of it, self.count, it becomes a class method, and we can run it off the class person.count. We cannot run it off the instances. So that's this count up here, because it has a double @ sign. It means it's a count. It's a class variable. Also, if we try to set that person count equals 4, undefined method. See, notice this. No method error is exactly what we get when we say just try to assign a regular variable person.count equals 4. It's a no method error because there's an undefined method count equals. So if it really does see this as if it was a method call. Okay, there's one more thing we're going to talk about here, and that is private methods. In many other languages, you can have a private method in a class, which is a method that the class uses to do something internally, but a method that is not given access to outside of the instance of the method. So all these methods that we're defining in here, if we just define a normal method, def.greet, def greet as we have right here, just becomes, our person instance dot greet. If we want to make a private method, we can do that right at the bottom here, and we put in the private keyword. Now, any methods we create after that private keyword cannot be used from outside. So let's create one here. We'll say def, and let's do this. Let's say we're going to call this get public weight. And all this is going to do is return weight minus 20, just as we have above. And that's something we don't want everyone to have access to. But, or actually no, let's do it this way instead. We'll say get real weight. And of course, there's no point in doing this at all because we can just have access to that weight variable. But just to give us something to write a class method about, a private method about, we'll just say return the weight variable. Then up here in our public weight, we can change this to say get real weight. And that's just how we call the method. Remember, of course, we could put parentheses after it if we want to, but that's not required in Ruby. So get real weight. And because this is within the method, this is within the object, we can access this get real weight method inside the object. But if we tried to call this from outside the object, on the object, Joe.getRealWeight, we couldn't do that. And let's see that right now. So I've required person, we'll just say Joe. We have to create Joe first, person.new. Again, Joe, and we'll just say 12, so he doesn't have to be employed. And now we'll just say Joe dot, we have to set the weight here, so we'll say Joe dot weight, we'll say, well, he's 12, so we'll just say, I have no idea, 90 pounds. Now, if we say Joe dot weight and we want to read it, what do we get? 70 pounds. At 12 years old, you might not be saying that, but anyway, for the case of our example. And if we say Joe.realWeight, no method error, and notice what we get here. Private method getRealWeight was called on this object, and that still returns the no method error, but notice it doesn't say that no method is available. It says that's a private method and we can't give you access to that. So that's how you would use a private method. And that, I think, is about all we're going to cover today on creating classes in Ruby. Well, I hope you've enjoyed Chapter 3 of Ruby for Newbies. In this lesson, we've looked at using the object class and how we can apply methods to that class and properties as well. We've looked at creating a class of our own, which is just starting with class, and then you put the name of the class, and then of course you have to use the end keyword. For instance methods, you just create regular methods, def, method name. For instance variables, you use the the @ sign and then the variable name. And of course, you then need to create your two methods for getting and setting that variable, var and then var equals. Of course, if it's just a regular, at var equals input, you can just use @or accessor, and remember to pass in a symbol with the name of the variable, :var. Of course, you can still access that via the @ sign var as well. And then, of course, you have the @or reader and @or writer options if you just want to create readable or just writable variables. We also talked about creating class methods using self.methodName and class variables using two @ signs. And finally, we discussed private methods. And then, of course, we discussed constructors as well. And constructors just allow you to have some initial setup when you create that object using className.new, and you pass in the parameters there, and that automatically runs the initialize function within your code. As always, we're going to end with our Ruby resource, and today the Ruby resource is Wise Poignant Guide to Ruby. Why the Lucky Stiff? You may have heard of him. He was and I guess still is, uh, quite a famous Rubyist, a famous person in the Ruby community who did a lot of work. And why am I using this all in the past tense? Well, because on August, I believe it was August 19th, 2009, he disappeared from the Ruby community. All of his websites and code that he had hosted everywhere, they all just disappeared, were removed, deleted, Twitter account, everything. He was gone and has not been heard from in the Ruby community since. What happened? My guess is as good as yours, but a lot of people have rallied together and restored the many excellent resources that Y made, and this is one of them, Y's Poignant Guide to Ruby. It's a very comical guide to learning Ruby, and if you have some free time, you'll want to read through it and be entertained just as much as you are taught. This shows a picture of a book right here, of course, like a print book, but you can get all the text. I don't actually think you can buy a print book of Wise Poignant Guide to Ruby. You can just get it online, and there's a PDF also available at this link, which I've got right down here. It's kind of long, of course, but if you just search Wise Poignant Guide to Ruby, this is the first or second thing that comes up. Well, that's all we have for you today, so thanks for watching Chapter 3 of Ruby for Newbies, and I'll see you around.